Fear is supposed to protect us. It is ancient. It lives in the dark, in the rustle just beyond the firelight, in the instinct that tells us something is wrong before the mind can explain why. We usually imagine fear as a survival tool for lonely places and isolated moments. A deserted road at midnight, a shadow in an empty hallway, a noise from the woods when no one else is around. But some of the most disturbing events in history do not happen in darkness, and they do not happen in isolation. Sometimes the impossible arrives in broad daylight. Sometimes it appears in front of dozens of people at once. Sometimes it descends into the safest, most ordinary place imaginable, a school playground full of children. We like to believe there is safety in numbers. We like to believe that if enough people witness the same thing, truth becomes untouchable. That reality cannot be denied when there are too many eyes, too many voices, too many memories pointing to the same moment. History suggests otherwise. Imagine being a child standing in the middle of recess. The sun is out. Your friends are shouting and laughing. Teachers are only a short distance away. Nothing about the morning feels unusual. Then someone starts screaming. You look up, and there it is, a metallic object in the sky, moving in a way that makes no sense. It hovers, it shifts, it descends. In one case, smaller planes seem to chase it. In another, strange beings appear near the edge of the playground itself. Children panic. Some run. Some freeze. Some never forget the eyes staring back at them. Then comes the part that may be even more unsettling than the sighting itself. The adults do not know what to do. Authorities deny, dismiss, or explain away what happened. Witnesses are told to keep quiet. Memories are challenged. Reputations are risked. And the children at the center of it all grow into adults carrying a question that never really leaves them. What did we see? Tonight, we are entering two of the most famous and most fiercely debated schoolyard UFO cases ever recorded. Two events on two different continents, separated by nearly 30 years, but linked by eerie similarities. In both cases, groups of children claimed they encountered something beyond conventional explanation. In both cases, the aftermath became almost as disturbing as the event itself. And in both cases, the official answers have never fully satisfied the people who were there. The first case happened in Australia in 1966. The second happened in Zimbabwe in 1994. And if even part of either story is true, then the world is stranger than most of us are willing to admit. The morning of April 6, 1966, began like any other school day in Clayton South, a working-class suburb of Melbourne, Australia. The Cold War was in full swing. The space race had turned the sky into a place of both fascination and dread. Humanity was looking upward with a strange mix of optimism and paranoia. Rockets, satellites, nuclear fears, and the dream of other worlds were already woven into everyday life. But none of that meant much to the students at Westall High School that Wednesday morning. Westall was an ordinary school bordered by open land and rough bush. Nearby was a patch of scrubland known as the Grange, a wild stretch of grass and trees that gave the area a slightly untamed edge. It was the kind of place students noticed without really thinking about it. A backdrop to daily routine, nothing more. As the mid-morning recess bell rang, students spilled out onto the oval. The air filled with the usual chaos of youth, voices, footsteps, games, small dramas, ordinary laughter. Then, somewhere in that noise, something changed. Someone pointed toward the sky. Then someone screamed. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A ripple of confusion spread across the playground, and within moments it became clear that hundreds of students were staring at the same thing. A strange silver object moving silently above the school grounds. Descriptions varied in small details, but the core image was remarkably consistent. Witnesses described a metallic disk, silver or gray, sometimes with a slight dome, gliding through the air without any visible means of propulsion. It was not behaving like a plane. It made no ordinary sound. It seemed to hover, tilt, and shift with an eerie smoothness. Some said it glowed faintly. Others said it seemed almost to shimmer against the sky. One of the most important witnesses was science teacher Andrew Greenwood, who came outside after hearing the commotion. He was not a child prone to fantasy. He was an adult, a teacher, someone expected to observe carefully and think rationally. What he saw only deepened the mystery. The object appeared to change its profile as it tilted, becoming thicker or thinner depending on the angle, as if it were banking in a way that made its shape itself seem unstable. Then the event escalated. Several small aircraft appeared in the sky. Witnesses often described them as light planes, similar to Cessnas. They were circling the object, pursuing it, attempting to keep pace with it. Suddenly, this was no longer just a strange sighting above a school. It looked like an interception, a chase, a surreal aerial scene unfolding in full view of children and teachers. Some students later claimed they saw not one object, but several, a larger central craft and smaller accompanying objects. Others focused on the single main disk, but all agreed that whatever it was, it did not belong in the ordinary language of weather balloons and routine aviation. Then the object dropped lower. It descended behind the trees near the Grange, apparently moving toward the scrubland just beyond the school. In an instant, curiosity and fear overwhelmed caution. Students began running. A wave of children surged toward the fence line and the area where they believed the object had come down. What they found there would become one of the most enduring and controversial details of the entire case. Witnesses who reached the area described a circle in the grass where something seemed to have landed or pressed down heavily. Some said the grass was flattened in a distinct shape. Others described signs of scorching as though the ground had been heated or burned. There were reports of a strange buzzing in the air and of an intense heat coming from the site. For some of the students, the moment tipped from thrilling mystery into genuine terror. This was not a prank to them. It was not funny. It was not exciting in a harmless way. It felt wrong. Students later described panic spreading through the crowd. Some cried. Some screamed. At least one girl was reportedly so overwhelmed that she collapsed and had to be taken away in an ambulance. In later retellings, witnesses remembered a sense of mass shock, as if the entire emotional atmosphere of the school had changed in seconds. This was not just something strange in the sky. For many, it felt like reality had cracked open in front of them. And then, almost immediately, the atmosphere around the event changed again. What should have become a straightforward investigation instead became something murkier. Witnesses later reported that officials arrived quickly, men in suits, authority figures, people who did not seem interested in openly documenting what children and teachers had seen, but in containing it. According to multiple accounts, students were warned not to speak about the incident. Teachers were allegedly told to remain silent or risk professional consequences. The school administration reportedly discouraged discussion. A local newspaper even ran a headline emphasizing the silence around the case. Whether every later detail of this suppression narrative is perfectly accurate is still debated. But what matters is that the perception of a cover-up became inseparable from the event itself. In the minds of the witnesses, the message was clear: stop talking. That alone transformed the incident from a strange sighting into a lifelong wound. Because once people believe they have seen something extraordinary, being told to deny it can be almost as traumatic as the sighting itself. Official explanations eventually surfaced, but they never settled the matter. Some suggested the object was a weather balloon. Others later pointed to the Highball Project, a high-altitude balloon program connected to radiation monitoring after British nuclear tests. These balloons were silver and unusual enough that, under certain conditions, they might explain part of what was seen. Skeptics also argued that nearby aircraft activity could account for the planes reported by witnesses, and that the landing traces may have been misinterpreted or exaggerated over time. On paper, these explanations sound plausible, more than plausible, perhaps. Memory is fragile. Children influence one another. A dramatic event can grow in the retelling. The 1960s were saturated with UFO imagery and Cold War anxiety. In that environment, it is not hard to imagine an unusual but mundane object becoming something else in the collective mind. And yet, that still leaves hard questions. Why did so many people describe the object as maneuvering in ways that seemed impossible? Why did multiple witnesses insist it descended into the Grange? Why did the event produce such a strong emotional impact on those who saw it? And why, perhaps most importantly, do so many of the surviving witnesses still stand by their accounts decades later? This is where Westall stops being a simple case file and becomes something far more unsettling. Even if you reject every extraordinary interpretation, you are still left with a mass experience that profoundly altered the people involved. A large group of children, and at least some adults, saw something they could not explain. They reacted with real fear. They carried that memory into adulthood. And many remain convinced, to this day, that they saw an unidentified craft and that powerful people wanted the story to disappear. That is why the Westall case has never really died. Because unresolved events are one thing. Unresolved events witnessed by children are another. There is something especially haunting about the idea that a group of young people could watch the impossible unfold in daylight, only to spend the rest of their lives being told in one way or another that their own eyes cannot be trusted. If Westall were the only case of its kind, it might be easier to file away as a product of its era. Anomalous, disturbing, but isolated. A schoolyard mystery shaped by Cold War skies and the power of collective memory. But Westall was not the end of the story. Nearly 3 decades later and thousands of miles away, something happened in Zimbabwe that would echo Westall in disturbing ways. Again, a school. Again, children. Again, broad daylight. Again, a group encounter no official explanation has ever fully erased. But this time, the story would go even further. Because in Zimbabwe, many of the children did not just claim to see a craft. They claimed to meet whoever came out of it. September 16th, 1994. Ruwa, Zimbabwe. Just outside Harare stood Ariel School, a private school attended by children from relatively affluent families. The setting was different from suburban Melbourne, but the morning itself began with the same innocence. Lessons, routine, recess, ordinary life unfolding under a bright sky. 2 days earlier, however, something dramatic had already unsettled the region. On the night of September 14th, people across parts of southern Africa had seen a spectacular fireball streak across the sky. Reports flooded in. Radio stations were overwhelmed. In a climate already rich with rumor and fascination, the event sparked talk of UFOs. It was later identified as the re-entry of a Russian rocket booster. But by then, public imagination had already been ignited. For adults, that kind of incident becomes news. For children, it becomes atmosphere. By the morning of September 16th, the idea of strange things in the sky was no longer abstract background noise. It was in conversations, whispers, headlines, and imagination. Then, around mid-morning, something happened at Ariel School that would become one of the most famous mass UFO encounters in modern history. While teachers were occupied indoors, dozens of children were outside for recess. Beyond the edge of the playground lay an overgrown, out-of-bounds area of grass, brush, and rough terrain. It was not far away, but it was far enough to feel separate, a threshold between the safe order of school and the wildness beyond it. Some of the children noticed flashes of light. Others heard a strange sound, described variously as buzzing, humming, or a high-pitched noise unlike anything familiar. Then they saw something in the brush or just beyond it, a silver object, or in some accounts more than one object, low to the ground or hovering near the trees. Sunlight reflected off it intensely. Some described it as disc-like, others described something more angular or house-like in shape. But the central claim was the same. A craft had landed or come down near the school. Then came the detail that would define the Ariel case forever. Figures appeared. The children described small beings, around 3 to 4 feet tall, with dark or black suits, narrow limbs, pale faces, and enormous black eyes. The faces were often described as strange and unnatural, almost plasticky, with tiny mouths and features that did not look human. Some children remembered long, dark hair, others did not. Some said the beings moved in a peculiar, bounding way, almost like slow motion. One especially strange description involved a figure seeming to move, disappear, and reappear in a way that felt completely wrong. For the younger children, the experience was pure terror. For some of the older ones, it became something even harder to explain. Several claimed that the beings did not speak aloud, but communicated telepathically. They described receiving impressions, images, or messages directly into their minds. The content of those messages has become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Warnings about technology, environmental destruction, humanity's future, and a damaged Earth. According to some of the children, the beings seemed to communicate that humans were becoming too technological, too disconnected, too destructive, and that the planet was in danger. Whether these were literal messages, emotional impressions, or later interpretations remains deeply contested. But the children who reported them spoke with a seriousness that has unsettled audiences for decades. Then, as suddenly as it began, the encounter ended. The children ran back in panic. They cried, they shouted, they tried to tell adults what had happened, and just as in Westall, the adult response became part of the trauma. At first, teachers were skeptical. The children were upset, emotional, frightened, and speaking over one another. To many adults, it must have sounded like chaos, fantasy, and playground contagion all at once. But the story would not stay contained. Too many children were saying some version of the same thing. Too many parents heard it when their children got home. Very quickly, the incident attracted media attention. This is where the Ariel case took an extraordinary turn. It did not remain a local rumor. It drew investigators, journalists, and eventually one of the most prominent psychiatrists in the world. Among the first to take the children seriously was Cynthia Hind, a well-known UFO researcher in Africa. She visited the school, interviewed the children, and collected drawings. Those drawings became iconic. Discs, hovering shapes, strange beings with huge eyes, all rendered in the blunt, unsettling style only children can produce. Whatever one believes about the event, the drawings are difficult to look at without feeling that something genuinely disturbing happened to the people who made them. Then came Dr. John E. Mack. Mack was no fringe eccentric shouting from the margins. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, head of the psychiatry department at Harvard Medical School, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. By the time he became involved with the Ariel case, he was already controversial for taking reports of alien encounters seriously, not necessarily as simple physical events, but as profound experiences that could not be reduced to ordinary psychiatric pathology. When Mack interviewed the Ariel children, he was struck by how sincere they appeared. He did not see obvious signs of fantasy, coaching, or fabrication. He found their emotional responses compelling. He concluded that the children had experienced something real at least, in the sense that it had deeply and genuinely happened to them. That conclusion would become one of the pillars of the Ariel legend, because from that moment forward, the case was no longer just a weird story from a school in Zimbabwe. It had a prestigious defender, and that made the case harder to dismiss, but also far more controversial. Skeptics pushed back immediately, and not without reason. Children are impressionable, group experiences are messy. Memory is vulnerable to contamination. Interviews conducted after dramatic events can unintentionally shape testimony. Questioning style matters. Timing matters. Prior beliefs matter. The intense attention surrounding the case may itself have reinforced certain details while erasing others. There is also the issue of context. The children had just lived through a regional wave of UFO excitement sparked by the rocket re-entry. They were not isolated from media. They were not blank slates untouched by cultural imagery. By the time of the Ariel encounter, the idea of alien visitation was already in the air, both literally and psychologically. This has led many skeptics to argue that the case was a classic example of mass suggestion or mass sociogenic experience. In that interpretation, an unusual stimulus, perhaps something ordinary seen under odd conditions, combined with fear, rumor, and social reinforcement to create a shared extraordinary narrative. Others proposed even more grounded possibilities. One of the strangest and most fascinating theories is that the children may have seen performers or puppeteers associated with educational outreach programs. In parts of Africa during that period, mobile theater groups used large puppets and unusual visual costumes to communicate public health messages. Some skeptics argue that, from a distance, such figures could appear uncanny enough to frighten children to be interpreted as non-human, especially if seen near a vehicle or structure half hidden by brush. The environmental message reported by some of the children has also been used to support this theory, since educational performances often centered on moral or social themes. On paper, it is a clever explanation. And yet, once again, something about the case resists easy closure, because the witnesses did not simply move on. Many of the Ariel children were tracked down years later as adults. By then, enough time had passed for childhood imagination to fade, for embarrassment to set in, for social pressure to wear down a fantasy, if that is all it had ever been. If the case had been nothing more than a playground delusion, many expected the adult witnesses to laugh at it, dismiss it, or admit they had once believed something that now seemed ridiculous. That is not what happened. Many of them still stood by what they saw. Not all interpreted it in exactly the same way, and memory had certainly shifted around the edges. But the emotional core remained remarkably durable. The sense of fear, the sense of contact, the sense that something impossible had happened, and that life afterward had never felt entirely normal again. Some described feeling isolated for years because of it. Some felt dismissed by family members and peers. Some struggled with the burden of carrying a story the wider world treated as absurd. For at least a few, the encounter became a permanent fracture line in their understanding of reality. And that may be the most haunting part of both Ariel and Westall. Not simply that strange things were seen, but that the people who saw them were changed. This is what makes these cases so difficult to kill. Skeptics can point out flaws in witness testimony, problems in the investigations, and powerful psychological mechanisms that can generate sincerely believed false memories. Believers can point to the consistency of the reports, the emotional conviction of the witnesses, and the failure of official explanations to account for every detail. Both sides can make real arguments. Both sides, in different ways, are dealing with the same uncomfortable truth. Something happened. Something happened at Westall High School in 1966. Something happened at Ariel School in 1994. Whether those somethings were extraterrestrial encounters, rare psychological cascades, misidentified technology, or some combination of factors we still do not fully understand, they broke the normal frame of reality for the people involved. And perhaps that is why these stories endure, because they force us into a place most of us hate: uncertainty. We are much more comfortable with a solved mystery, even a disappointing solution, than with a question that refuses to die. A weather balloon, a rocket booster, a puppet troupe, mass hysteria, memory contamination. Those explanations offer closure. They restore order. They allow the universe to go back to behaving itself. But for the witnesses, closure never really came. The children of Westall grew up remembering a silver object over their school and the chilling feeling that authority wanted silence more than truth. The children of Ariel grew up remembering impossible eyes in the brush and a message they were never supposed to receive. And the rest of us are left standing outside those memories, trying to decide what is more disturbing: that they saw visitors from somewhere beyond our understanding, or that the human mind is powerful enough to generate experiences so convincing, so collective, and so life-altering that they can brand a person forever. Either possibility is frightening, because if the witnesses were right, then we are not alone, and whatever is out there has already stepped into our world quietly, casually, in front of children. But if the witnesses were wrong, if no craft landed and no beings emerged, then we are forced to confront something almost as unsettling: that reality, memory, fear, and belief can combine in ways powerful enough to create shared nightmares in the middle of a sunny school day. Maybe that is why these cases linger so stubbornly in the cultural imagination. They do not just ask, "Do you believe in UFOs?" They ask something much more intimate. Do you trust your own eyes? Do you trust memory? Do you trust authority when it tells you nothing happened? And if dozens of children look at the same patch of sky or the same line of trees and come away convinced their world has changed, at what point does dismissal become its own kind of blindness? In the end, Westall and Ariel remain suspended between explanation and myth, between evidence and emotion, between the need to believe and the need to debunk. They are not clean stories. They are not easy stories. They are messy, human, unresolved stories. And that may be exactly why they still unsettle us. Because somewhere, buried beneath the theories and documentaries and arguments, there is a simpler image that refuses to fade. A schoolyard, a bright morning, children looking up, and something impossible staring back.